It's Killershrewfan's 12 Days of Reviews. Hello everyone and welcome to Day 3 of Killershrewfan's 12 Days of Reviews. Today we will be taking a look at this, the 2019 Safari Limited Spinosaurus. Now, 2019 was an undeniably mixed bag of a year for Safari Limited. Some of their models were quite nice, others stirred a lot of controversy in the dinosaur collecting community. Not least of which was this Spinosaurus. And I have received a lot of people wondering if I would ever do a review on this model. I did film one way back when, but I never got around to putting it together, so I decided let's do it all over again and release it as part of this year's 12 Days of Reviews, because that's what we like to do. We like to take a look at some of the most talked about models of the year, and this was certainly one of them. Also, with this sort of influx of Spinosaurus dinosaur models that have come onto the market, I mean, you've got Rebor coming out with their grab-and-go line, you've got the PNSO Spinosaurus, you've got the Papo Limited Edition Spinosaurus, and of course, you've also got this Spinosaurus. So we have gotten a lot of Spinosaurs this year, so I figured this was the time to kind of talk about a select few of them, and we're going to start by talking about this one here. Now, with all of that in mind, before we go forward, yes, Safari Limited is a toy company. They make toys for kids, but adults also do collect these dinosaur toys. I myself am an adult collector, and as such, this review is being done by an adult collector for adult collectors. That's my little audio disclaimer. So if you're 13 years or younger, this video is not meant for you. It is meant for older collectors such as myself. So there's my little audio disclaimer. I hate doing that, but we have to get it out of the way. So without further ado, I think it's time we take a look at Safari Limited's controversial Spinosaurus. Let's do this! So taking a closer look at the head of this Spinosaurus, as you can see, Safari Limited have not skimped out on the detail with this model. Scales cover the entire surface area of this face. The eye is done in a nice lime green color with a black pupil, and the nostrils are properly placed further up on the snout, and the nasal crest has also been addressed. The teeth are individually sculpted, but the paint is a bit sloppy, running up onto the lips and across the gums on the lower jaw, as you can see. I'm also not a huge fan of just the overall shape of the skull of this thing. There's something about it that doesn't feel like there's a lot of structure to it. It's like they tried to put the notch into the skull, but didn't do it in the proper way, and because of that, this thing has a very floppy looking upper jaw, and it feels like I'm looking at Snuffleupagus rather than a Spinosaurus, so that is a bit unfortunate. The cheek flaps are also not painted, they just kind of blend into the rest of the skull, and that is a bit unfortunate. Taking a look at the palate of this Spinosaurus, as you can see, it has been addressed, if only in the slightest, with some slight sculptural details and a nice gloss to make it come alive. The tongue has been sculpted with a rough, sandy texture, and as you can see, the throat recedes very far back, giving this thing a functional-looking gullet, which I think is very cool that they would carve it out so deep on this model. If we take a look at the detail on the rest of the body, as you can see, there's a lot of wrinkles and folds of skin that have been saddled with sort of uniform crocodilian scale patterns, as well as larger scoots that begin at the back of the skull and run down to the sail of the body. You've also got a dual line of scoots on the midsection, and the rest of the body is really covered with these very similarly shaped scales of rectangular nature, and as you get down to the end of the tail, you can see these crocodilian ridges sort of sprouting up about halfway down. Going up the other side of the body, as you can see, the sculptural details are very similar. They just don't feel very organic on this model. There's something about them that feels very carved out, very hand-done. It's nowhere near as visually appealing as some of Safari Limited's other sculptural details, and that is unfortunate. Having a look at the underbelly of this Spinosaurus, as you can see, again, very similar scale patternings with rectangular scales covering the entire surface area. You've also got the copyright right there, along with a cloaca that has been included, and as you can see, the sculptural rectangular scales continue all the way down to the tip of the tail. Taking a look at the arms and claws of the Spinosaurus, there is some nice musculature going on in this area. I'm a big fan of how barrel-chested this Spinosaurus feels. The claws have been dulled down for play safety and are covered in a nice, sleek, black coloration. Not a huge fan of the lack of weathering going on, but I can forgive it, I suppose. And again, lovely musculature on this arm that is bent up and held slightly at the ready. Now for a big area of contention, the legs of this Spinosaurus. As you can see, they are very crocodilian in nature with webbing between the toes. The toe claws are very dull and do not look like they have any sort of sharpness to them. That's one area that I'm not a huge fan of. I get that it has to be play safe for kids, but even these feel very, very soft and not at all formidable. They managed to achieve a soft and safe playability on the claws, but not on these toes, and that is unfortunate. The sculptural details are very similar to the rest of the body, but there is some nice musculature going on in the calf there, as you can see. We'll get more into the controversial talking points of these legs once we talk about the overall posing, but I do think the musculature in the appendages was well handled on Safari Limited's part. So, talking about that iconic Spinosaurus sail, I do think they have the shape correct, but I'm not a huge fan of the uniform scales making their way up onto the sail. It doesn't feel visually different enough to separate itself from the rest of the creature, and because of that, there's something that feels very inorganic about it. It feels like it's wearing a sheet of texture over itself rather than revealing its actual skin patterns. It doesn't work as a thin membranous covering of skin, and it also doesn't work as like a hump back because the sail itself is so thin, so it doesn't really feel like it knows what it wants to be, and because of that, the sail on this Spinosaurus is yet another disappointing element. And now for easily the most controversial area of the Spinosaurus, the pose. As you can see, it is in sort of a floating pose with the head craned back and looking off to the right, while the arms are held at the ready and the legs just kind of floating behind it, half bent. And a lot of people are not a fan of the legs. They feel like they're anatomically dysfunctional. They feel like they're soft, like they don't have any purpose. They just feel like they're just attached and kind of flowing in the wind. And me personally, it doesn't bother me all that much. It's very clear that the Spinosaurus is crocodilian in nature, and when crocodiles swim, a lot of that movement is in the tail. And Safari captured that thrashing tail motion very well on this Spinosaurus, so honestly, the pose doesn't bother me so much. I do think they could have put a little more attention in the bending of the legs back there to give them a little more life, but honestly, there's enough visual information to convey what they were going for with this pose, and it kind of reminds me of the old National Geographic illustration of the swimming Spinosaurus, so yeah, in that regard, it's not the end of the world for me. A much bigger issue for me is the palette of this Spinosaurus. Now, I don't mind the colorations. I shouldn't have said palette, I should have said the paint scheme itself. The palette is fine. The amber colors, the sort of rusty brown highlights, and then the dark black stripings, that's all okay for me. It's a very bold color scheme, a very unique color scheme, and one that I don't mind seeing. My issue comes with how it's applied. It feels like there's rhyme and reason to the head and tail of this thing, but the sail on the main body, the lines that are working on it just feel so lazy and haphazardly applied that I cannot honestly say I like it. There is a method to the madness of animal patternings, and I am not feeling that on this Spinosaurus, especially with the midsection. I think they could have created a very, very cool paint scheme with the sail if they had just kind of sat down and planned it out, rather than just doing random lines that split and branch and connect to each other in various ways. It's not very visually appealing, and it does not feel like they planned it out at all, which is definitely a disappointment, especially when we're talking about, the focal point of this creature, its namesake. It just feels like that's something that they could have done to further separate the sail and make it much more visually striking, as if they kind of planned out a unique paint scheme for that region of the creature, but instead they just went back to the lines and then applied them randomly, and it's it's a very disappointing paint scheme on this Spinosaurus. Now, it is very big. The size is easily the most impressive thing about this thing, coming in at 15 inches, which is about 38 centimeters long. And then from the base all the way to the top of the sail there, you're looking at right around, just under 4 3/4 inches, which is about 12 centimeters off the ground. So a very sizable Spinosaurus indeed, and one of Safari's largest offerings that I currently own. For size comparisons, here it is next to the also new for 2019 Safari Limited Carnotaurus, a beautiful, if inaccurate, model from the company. And as you can see, these two, the Spinosaurus absolutely destroys it in terms of the length and the height. Next up, we're going to go ahead and bring in the Giganotosaurus, and as you can see, the subtle texturing and skin details on this Giganotosaurus are so much more visually appealing than the garish, carved out scales of this Spinosaurus. They are pretty similar in terms of their overall height, yet the Spinosaurus does edge it out in terms of the length, especially if you stretch that tail all the way out to its fullest potential. Next up, for size comparison, we're going to go ahead and bring in the old school Carnegie Spinosaurus, and as you can see, this model is just so much more appealing to look at than the new one. Of course, the new one is going to be more accurate. That's a given. We have a better understanding of the animal at this point, but just looking at the heads of these things, oh my gosh, it's night and day in comparison to the overall appeal. The Carnegie offering just feels so much more lifelike and believable. And finally, the comparison that everyone has to do, the Safari Limited Tyrannosaurus Rex compared to the new for 2019 Safari Limited Spinosaurus. And again, looking at these two side by side, it is just night and day in terms of sculptural detail. There's so much finessed sculpture going on in the Tyrannosaurus Rex with those carefully sculpted feathers, and the paint gradation feels so much better and more appealing to the eye than on the Spinosaurus. It is no contest when comparing these two, which is the better offering. Well, everyone, there you have it. Safari Limited's 2019 Spinosaurus. Overall, it is certainly an underwhelming offering to a very much beloved species, and definitely a stain on Safari Limited's 2019 lineup. The competition offered from other companies this year certainly does not help the case of this Spinosaurus. There are much better offerings of the species either coming or already released, so this one, I think, just deserves to be swept under the rug and forgotten. You can easily skip it. You're not missing out on anything glorious if you do. So I think I'm going to go ahead and give this Safari Limited Spinosaurus a 5.5 out of 10. The sculptural details are garish. The paint scheme is too lackadaisical for my taste. And it's just overall weak in comparison to some of the other models. As always, I want to know what you guys think of this Spinosaurus. Do you own it yet? Are you planning to pick it up? What Spinosaurus model are you most looking forward to getting for your own collection? Leave all your comments down below. I love reading through them. And if you enjoyed this video, don't be afraid to hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe on the way out for more of Killer Shrew Fan's 12 Days of Reviews. We will see you tomorrow for the next one. Bye-bye.